Hey guys, tonight we're stepping off the tube, pulling on our overcoats and walking straight into the grey, foggy, gloriously strange world of 1950s London. Not the London of royal weddings and polished guidebooks. The real London. The one that smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage, where your neighbour knew exactly what you had for dinner because the walls were that thin, and where the height of luxury was a tin of biscuits you were saving for Christmas. So, before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly, you've done everyone listening a favour tonight. Comments like yours are what shape this channel, and I mean that. If you haven't already, you can also catch the channel on Spotify. Link is in the description, so you can drift off to this wherever you are. Now dim those lights, pull the duvet up, maybe switch on a fan for that lovely white noise, and get yourself properly horizontal. Before we dive in, let's ask a few questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live in London when the war had just ended and nobody quite knew what came next? Did everyone really eat grey food? Was rationing still a thing in the 1950s? And if so, what exactly were people rationing? Did families really crowd around one small television set like it was a campfire? Did people genuinely queue for everything? Or is that just a myth we've polished up for tourists? Could you survive a week in a London terrace house with no central heating, a 2-ring gas hob, and a landlady who thought a hot bath once a week was perfectly adequate? And what on earth did people do on a Sunday when every single shop was shut and the whole city seemed to collectively exhale? Well, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1952 London. The Festival of Britain bunting has come down, the king has just died, and there's a new young queen on the way. Your breakfast is waiting and it is beige. Welcome. Try not to breathe too deeply. There's a fog coming in. Let's talk about waking up. You're lying in a narrow bedroom in a Victorian terrace somewhere in Bermondsey, Hackney or Shepherd's Bush, and the first thing you notice is the cold. Not a gentle morning chill. A full, bone-settling, nose-numbing cold that has crept in overnight because there is no central heating in this house. There has never been central heating in this house, and nobody you know has ever lived anywhere with central heating. The window has a faint skin of condensation on the inside. You pull the eider down tighter. Somewhere downstairs a kettle is beginning to whistle, which means your mother or your wife has been up for 20 minutes already, because that is simply how it works. The bedroom itself is not a room designed for comfort in the modern sense. It is designed for sleeping in, and that is more or less the limit of its ambitions. There is a wardrobe, a large dark wooden one that came with the house, or was passed down from someone's parents, a chest of drawers, and a bed with a metal frame. The mattress is flock or possibly horsehair, and it has formed a kind of valley in the centre from years of use. You sleep in the valley. You do not choose to. You simply roll there every night because physics is persistent. The floor is bare boards, or, if you're lucky, a piece of linoleum that has been cut to fit and curls slightly at the corners. There is no carpet in the bedroom because carpet in bedrooms is not yet a standard expectation. There might be a small rug beside the bed, something handmade, or a remnant so that your feet do not hit cold lino first thing in the morning. You step on the rug. You stand there for a moment. You look at the window where the condensation on the inside tells you everything you need to know about the temperature difference between inside and outside, which is to say, not enough of a difference. Getting dressed happens quickly, because standing still in a cold room invites misery. In winter you might dress inside the bed, pulling clothes under the covers before committing to the full exposure of standing upright. This is not a sign of weakness. This is a rational response to the situation. Modern people pay money to stand in cold chambers for health benefits. You're doing it every morning for free and you're not finding it beneficial at all. The house itself has a particular morning sound to it. The pipes clank as the water heats up. The floorboards creak in a specific sequence as whoever is downstairs moves from the kitchen to the back room. The coal delivery, if it is Monday, will come later. The coalman with his sacks black with dust, heaving 100-weight bags through the side gate to the coal hole under the front steps. You know the rhythm of it. You've known it your whole life. The bedroom window looks out onto a backyard or a strip of garden, and beyond that the backs of the houses on the next street which look exactly like yours. Chimney stacks on every roof line, most of them smoking. The whole street is making the same slow, smoky morning effort to warm up. There is something oddly companionable about it. All these households, invisible to each other, all doing exactly the same thing at the same time, pulling on their socks, cursing the cold, heading downstairs toward the kettle. You're one of 8 or 9 million people living this same morning right now in this city. And somehow that thought is not lonely. It is almost comforting. Almost. Before you can face the day, you need to do something about yourself. And in 1950s London, that is a more complicated proposition than you might expect. The bathroom, if your house has one, is a small, unheated room with linoleum so cold underfoot it functions essentially as a punishment. The hot water comes from a gas geyser bolted to the wall above the bath, a device that looks like it was designed during the Blitz and has been quietly threatening to explode ever since. You light it with a match, stand back, wait for the little clunk that tells you it has decided not to kill you today, and then run exactly enough hot water to make a bath that is warm at one end and cold at the other. The geyser is a machine with opinions. On some mornings it fires first time. On other mornings it makes a sound like a man clearing his throat very slowly, and then produces a thin stream of water at a temperature that could best be described as disappointed. You adjust the cold tap. You adjust it again. You stand there in your vest trying to find the precise combination of hot and cold that produces something acceptable, and eventually you give up and get in anyway, and it is fine, mostly if you work quickly and do not stop to think about it. Not every house in 1950s London has a bathroom at all. In the older terraces, particularly in the East End and in the denser parts of South London, the indoor bathroom is not a given. You might have a tin bath that lives in the scullery and is brought out on Friday nights and filled with kettles boiled on the stove. The whole family uses it in sequence, in the same water, in order of seniority. Father first, then mother, then children from oldest to youngest. And by the time the youngest child gets in, the water has a texture and a temperature that requires a certain fortitude to enter voluntarily. The weekly bath is a genuine weekly event. In between you wash at the sink, face, hands, what the Victorians called top and tailing, using a flannel and cold water from the tap, warm if you have heated a kettle. This is not considered inadequate. This is simply what washing is. The idea that you might shower every single morning in hot water for as long as you like would strike most people in 1950s London as a description of either a hotel or the afterlife. Teeth are cleaned with a toothbrush and powder. Toothpaste in a tube exists, but powder is still common. A chalky pink substance you dip the brush into and apply with commitment. There is one bathroom, one mirror, and potentially 5 or 6 people who need to use both before 9 o'clock. There is a queue. There is always a queue. This, incidentally, is excellent training for the bus. Hair is managed separately. Women's hair is set, pinned and dried and coaxed into shape the night before, or maintained under a headscarf during the day. Men apply Brill cream or a similar pomade with the seriousness of people applying a technical coating, combing it flat with a side parting that will not move until evening. Looking presentable is not vanity. It is a social obligation, and everyone takes it seriously right up until they step outside into the coal smoke, which undoes about 40% of the effort immediately. Right. Time to eat. And here is where 1950s London really shows its character, because breakfast in a working family home during this period is not a meal so much as a philosophical commitment to the colour beige. Rationing only ended fully in 1954. Yes, 1954, which means for the first half of the decade everything from butter to bacon is still being doled out in carefully weighed portions that would make a modern person weep directly into their avocado toast. You get your ration of margarine. You get your egg. One, maybe. Fried in lard in a pan that has been seasoned by approximately 400 previous fry-ups and has never once been washed with soap. The margarine deserves a moment of attention, because if you grew up after 1980, you may not fully appreciate what it represents. It is not butter. It is not trying to be butter. It is a pale yellow substance made from hydrogenated vegetable fat that is doing its very best and still managing to fall short every single morning without apology. You spread it on toast, white bread, sliced if you buy it from the baker, cut thick and slightly uneven if someone at home has done it, and you eat it because it is what there is. And wasting food in 1952 is not a personal choice. It is a moral failing with neighbourhood witnesses. The fry-up is the gold standard of weekday breakfasts, when the budget and the rations allow it, and it is approached with a seriousness that borders on ceremonial. Bacon, back bacon, in a pan, with the fat rendering slowly, an egg, possibly a fried slice of bread soaking up whatever grease is left. On a very good morning there might be a tomato, halved and placed face down in the pan, or a mushroom or two. Sausages are for weekends. Everything makes a sound in this kitchen. The laird spits. The kettle on the gas ring begins its long build toward the boil. The radio, if you have one, is on, probably the BBC Home Service, which delivers the news and then possibly some light music and a tone of voice that suggests everything is basically fine. The kitchen is warm from the cooking, which is the only room that reliably is. Everyone gravitates toward it in the morning. The children eat standing up if the table is small. The dog, if there is a dog, positions itself at the edge of the oven's warmth with the strategic patience of an old soldier. Tea is the first thing and the last thing, and the thing between things. It is brewed in a pot which has been warming with a splash of boiling water first, and it is the colour of a well-worn boot. You drink it with milk and sugar, 2 sugars, because you have earned them. After rationing ends, things improve in increments. Butter appears with more confidence. A banana, which was essentially mythological during the war years, and continued to be rare into the early 1950s, becomes available again, and the first time a child who has never had one receives one, they have no idea what to do with it, which is both funny and quietly heartbreaking. By the late 1950s, the British breakfast has not changed its shape much, but it has relaxed. There is more of everything. The table still has a particular morning clutter to it. The marmalade jar, the bottle of HP sauce, the folded newspaper, and the radio is still on, and the tea is still the colour of a well-worn boot. But the meal feels less like rationing and more like choice. And that difference, small as it sounds, is enormous. You have eaten your beige breakfast, you have survived the geyser, and now you must address the wardrobe. This, too, is a ritual. Men in 1950s London do not roll out of bed and throw on whatever is comfortable. There is a correct uniform for leaving the house, and it involves a suit. Not a nice suit, necessarily, a grey suit, or possibly a slightly darker grey suit, worn with a collared shirt, a tie, a hat, and shoes that have been polished the night before, because your father polished his shoes every night, and his father before him, and the tradition is simply not up for discussion. The suit has been pressed. The collar is clean. You look from a distance entirely presentable, and from up close, entirely exhausted. The suit is not new. It may not have been new when you got it. Suits in 1950s working-class London are bought to last, and they do last, with a kind of grim determination that modern fast fashion has entirely abandoned. You have a good suit for Sunday, for funerals, for job interviews, and a weekday suit which has been good and is now transitioning into working life. The elbows may be slightly shiny. The lining has been repaired at the sleeve. None of this is visible from a respectful distance, and a respectful distance is where most social interaction in 1950s London takes place. Women's dress follows a different but equally structured logic. In the early part of the decade, the fashions of the late 1940s still have momentum. The new look that Christian Dior launched in 1947, with its nipped waist and full skirt, has trickled down from the fashion houses through the department stores and into the pattern books sold in Woolworths, so women are making versions of it at home, on sewing machines, in the evenings. A house with a Singer sewing machine is a house that can keep up with fashion without paying department store prices. The machine is kept in the front room. Fabric is bought by the yard. Patterns are shared between neighbours. The result is not Dior, but it has the same general geometry, and geometry is a reasonable start. Hats are not optional, not yet. A man without a hat outdoors is underdressed. A woman without a hat is making a statement she may not intend to make. The hat is the full stop at the end of the outfit. Without it, everything else is a sentence that hasn't quite finished. Gloves too, for women going anywhere of significance. Not because it is cold, necessarily, but because bare hands in certain contexts still carry a slight implication of carelessness. Children are dressed by someone else, with an emphasis on durability and the capacity to be cleaned. Boys wear short trousers until they are approximately 12, regardless of the weather, regardless of the temperature, regardless of the opinion of the boy's legs on the matter. Long trousers are a milestone. Girls wear dresses or skirts with cardigans. Everything is grey or navy or brown. Colour in children's clothing is rationed by some unspoken agreement that brightness is a luxury best deferred. By the time the household has assembled itself for the day, coats on, hats on, bags in hand, it looks like a small, slightly weary expedition setting off into the city, which is exactly what it is. Getting to work in 1950s. London is an exercise in collective suffering performed with remarkable composure. Most working Londoners are travelling by bus or tube, and both options have their particular character. The bus is freezing on the upper deck, where everyone sits anyway because sitting downstairs feels slightly too much like giving up. The tube is warm but carries the distinctive scent of thousands of people in wool coats who have also been navigating the aforementioned geyser situation. You stand with your newspaper folded into quarters, you do not make eye contact, and if the train stops in a tunnel for 4 minutes for no apparent reason, you say nothing because that is simply what you do. The London bus in the 1950s is a double-decker, red, with an open platform at the back where you board, and a conductor who comes to you with a rack of tickets and a machine that punches them with a satisfying click. The conductor knows the route, knows the regulars, knows if someone is trying to ride further than their fare allows, and manages all of this with a running commentary that ranges from cheerful to deeply dry depending on the morning. The bus does not run to a precise timetable so much as to a general intention. It will arrive. It has always arrived. It will arrive now within a window of several minutes either side of the number on the stop. The tube is the underground, and in 1952 it is a system that has been running since 1863 and looks, in places, as though it has not been repainted since. The oldest lines have wooden escalators. They will not be replaced with metal ones until much later, after a fire at King's Cross in the 1980s makes them a liability no one can defend. The carriages have a particular smell: hot metal, newspaper, coal dust filtered down from above. They are not air-conditioned. In summer, the tube is approximately the temperature of a proving oven. In winter, it is the warmest place many commuters will stand all day, and they appreciate it in the distracted, unacknowledged way that Londoners appreciate anything good. Cycling to work is common, particularly for men in the skilled trades and factory workers in the inner boroughs. The roads are not yet overwhelmed with cars. Car ownership is still the province of the professional class and above, and the streets have a different texture because of it. A bicycle journey across London in 1952 is faster than it will be in 20 years, and quieter. The main hazards are the trams, which are still running on some routes until the last one is retired in 1952, and the buses, and the occasional enormous lorry grinding out of a side street. Some people simply walk, particularly in the denser parts of inner London, where home and work are within the same neighbourhood. Walking is the obvious option. It is free. It requires no timetable, and it takes you through streets that you know with the precise, granular familiarity of someone who has walked them since childhood, who can tell you which pavement is uneven, which corner smells of bakery in the morning, and which pub has already got its front doors open at 7:30, which is either a scandal or a comfort depending on your present circumstances. Nobody enjoys the commute. Nobody complains about it either, not really. It is simply the price of working in London, absorbed into the daily rhythm like the cold and the coal smoke and the tea. If you work in an office in 1950s London, you're operating in an environment that has been specifically engineered to feel both important and deeply tedious at the same time. The building is almost certainly Victorian or Edwardian. The rooms are painted in shades of institutional green or cream. The windows are single glazed and rattle when the wind comes up from the river, and the heating is either off entirely or set to a temperature that suggests someone in facilities has a grudge. Your desk has a telephone with a dial, a wooden in-tray piled with forms, and a blotter that you use without entirely being sure what it is for. The office hierarchy is a very specific thing in 1950s Britain, and it is enforced with a precision that would be recognisable to anyone familiar with military rank. The senior partner or manager has an office with a door. Below that, the assistants and executives sit in a general office, a large room with rows of desks, the more senior nearer the window or the side that faces the street, the juniors nearer the door or the filing cabinets. Secretaries, almost all women, almost all young, sit at smaller desks, often arranged just outside the manager's offices, typing with a speed and accuracy that is genuinely impressive and almost completely unacknowledged. The typewriter is the engine of office life. The sound of a 1950s office is the sound of typewriter keys striking paper, a constant mechanical percussion punctuated by the bell that announces the end of a line and the ratchet of the carriage return. Errors are corrected with white paper and a brush of chalky fluid, or in extremis with a fresh piece of paper and the quiet, private misery of starting over. There is no Control-Z. There is no undo. There is only the letter you have already typed, the error you have already made, and the decision about whether it is visible enough to matter. Lunch is a fixed event. You stop at 1 o'clock, you eat, either a packed lunch brought from home in a paper bag, or a pie from the shop across the road, or the set meal at the cafe on the corner that does 2 courses for 2 shillings, and you return at 2. The lunch hour is not flexible. It begins and ends at the times it begins and ends, and if you come back at 2:05 you have committed an act that will be noted, not loudly, but noted. There is a social arithmetic operating in the 1950s office that requires everyone to be where they are supposed to be at the time they are supposed to be there, and the system runs on the mutual agreement to maintain it. Women in the office are present in significant numbers in 1950s London, but mostly in particular roles: typists, shorthand secretaries, clerks. The assumption, largely unexamined, is that these roles are transitional, that a woman will work until she marries and then leave, returning perhaps part-time after the children are school age. There are women who do not follow this pattern, who build careers across the decade, who end up managing departments and knowing more about the business than most of the men above them. They are not rare. They are simply not the subject of the story the decade is telling about itself. At 5 o'clock the office empties, coats on, hats on, out through the revolving door and back into the city. The day's work is done, and the papers on the desk will be there in the morning exactly as you left them. Nothing has moved. Nothing has changed. Everything will begin again at 9. For a large portion of London's population in the 1950s, work does not mean an office with a rattling window and a telephone. It means a factory, a warehouse, a dockyards job, or a trade. And it means starting early, finishing late, and leaving with every part of your body making a quiet complaint. The East End and South London are still beating with industrial life. Printing works, clothing factories, furniture makers, the vast machinery of the docks at Tilbury and the Pool of London. You clock in at 7:30, and if you are 1 minute late, there is a man with a clipboard who will note it down in a way that suggests it will be following you to the grave. The factory floor is its own world with its own language, its own social structure, and its own particular noise. A noise that is not one noise, but several overlapping ones. The rhythmic thump of presses, the whir of lathes, the scrape of pallets, voices pitched to carry over the machinery with the practiced volume of people who have learned exactly how loud is enough. You do not shout unless you need to. You develop over years the ability to communicate in that factory volume, and it becomes strange to use your indoor voice at home in the evenings, where the sudden quiet of the kitchen feels almost loud by comparison. The docks are something else again. The Port of London in the early 1950s is still one of the busiest in the world. Tea from India and Ceylon, timber from Scandinavia, sugar from the Caribbean, meat from Argentina, and the men who work them are dockers, doing casual labour that is allocated every morning at the call-on, where you present yourself and hope to be selected. It is not secure, it is not guaranteed. A docker with a family knows that a slow week in the port means a lean week at home, and there is nothing in between the work and the nothing. The trade unions are strong, the solidarity is fierce, and the grievances are many and legitimate. In the clothing factories of the East End, which have been Jewish-owned and staffed since the Great Migrations of the late 19th century, and which are now beginning to employ newer arrivals from the Caribbean and South Asia, the work is piece rate. You are paid for what you produce. Every minute is quantifiable, every movement has a value, and the experienced machinist sitting beside you is producing twice what you manage in your first weeks, and making it look like she's barely trying. Because she's barely trying. Because she's been doing it for 20 years. The tea break is sacred. Twice a day, mid-morning and mid-afternoon, the machines stop or slow, and the kettle goes on, and for 15 minutes the factory becomes temporarily human. People eat sandwiches and talk about last night's football and complain about the foreman, and compare the quality of one another's tea, and it is in these 15 minutes that the social fabric of the place is maintained, not in the hours of work around them. At the end of the shift, you clock out, literally punch your card through a time clock, and the day ends with a precision that office work rarely achieves. When the hooter goes, you are done. What happens after the hooter is yours. You're sore, possibly, and you are dirty, certainly, and you are heading home on the bus with everyone else from the same shift, which means the upper deck is full of people who all smell of the same factory in slightly different concentrations. But you're done for the day, and that matters. That clean line between work and not work is one of the things the factory gives you that the office, with its culture of staying late and proving commitment, sometimes does not. Let's talk about shopping, because in 1950s London, going to the shops is not a leisure activity. It is a strategic undertaking. Rationing has shaped the shopping habits of every family in the city for over a decade, and even as it finally lifts meat last in 1954, the instincts remain. You do not impulse buy, you do not throw things in a trolley, you queue, you wait. You know exactly which shopkeeper has a decent cut of lamb this week, and which one has been padding out his mince since 1947. The corner shop is your primary interface with the food supply, and it is run by someone who knows your name, your mother's name, and your precise account balance. The corner shop, and there is one on almost every street corner in working London, is a hybrid institution. It sells groceries and it provides credit, and it functions as the information exchange for the immediate neighbourhood, all at the same time. The grocer behind the counter knows who is behind on their account, who has just had a baby, who got the factory foreman's job, and who was seen coming home very late last Tuesday, in circumstances that do not reflect well on anyone. This knowledge is power, deployed with discretion and occasionally without it. The shopping trip happens daily because there is no refrigerator. You buy today's food today. The housewife, and it is almost always the housewife, does her rounds, the baker for bread, the butcher for whatever the budget and the ration allows, the greengrocer for whatever is in season, which in January means potatoes, cabbage, onions, and a kind of stoic acceptance of their limitations. The fishmonger on Fridays. The dairy for milk, which is delivered to the doorstep by a milkman in a float that moves slower than a determined pedestrian, arriving before 7 and leaving 2 pints in a wire carrier on the front step. The high street of 1950s London is a thing of specific and now mostly vanished texture. There are no supermarkets yet. The first major supermarket chains do not arrive in Britain until the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they arrive to some suspicion. The idea of helping yourself to goods from shelves without asking a person behind a counter feels mildly transgressive to a generation raised on the personal transaction. The shop is a relationship. You are known in it. The shopkeeper carries your account in a book. The market is the other option. Street markets in Petticoat Lane, Brick Lane, Brixton, Portobello Road, loud, outdoor, cash only, with vendors who could be selling vegetables or fabric or second-hand tools or something of unclear provenance that they are not inviting questions about. Markets are where you get the deal. Markets are where you stretch the money. A good market trader knows the price of everything and has strong opinions about whether you're being offered a fair one. By the end of the decade, the first self-service shops are appearing. You take a wire basket. You walk the aisles. You choose. It is more efficient and slightly lonelier, and it represents the beginning of the end of something that the 1950s still has intact. The idea that buying your food is a conversation rather than a transaction. If there is a single institution that explains the social life of 1950s London better than any other, it is the pub. Not as a place of excess or excitement, but as a place of specific, reliable comfort. A room with a fire, a landlord who recognises you, a pint of bitter that costs 11 pence, and the understanding that whatever is happening outside those frosted glass windows, in here things are manageable. The pub is where the men of the street go after work to decompress, where news travels before it reaches the newspapers, where arguments are had and then quietly set aside, and where the whole, slightly battered machinery of working-class London social life is maintained on a diet of mild ale and shared silence. The pub has rooms, and the rooms have different functions and different prices. The public bar is where working men drink, bare boards, plain benches, the cheapest beer. The saloon bar, sometimes called the lounge, is slightly smarter. Upholstered seats, a carpet, a penny more per pint, and that penny difference represents an entire social distinction. Couples come to the saloon bar. Older women come to the saloon bar. Men who want to signal a degree of respectability come to the saloon bar. The public bar does not judge anyone for drinking in the public bar, but it notices if you walk through the wrong door. The landlord and landlady are, in most cases, a married couple who live above the pub and have chosen this specific life of other people's company with their eyes open. The good landlord remembers your drink. The good landlord knows when to top you up and when to gently slow you down. He knows the histories, who has lost someone recently, who has just got good news, who is in no state to drive the conversation tonight, and should be pointed quietly at the darts board. The pub is a managed social environment, and the management is mostly invisible, which is the sign that it is working. Women in the pub are a complicated topic in the 1950s. They exist in the pub, and they drink in the pub, particularly in the saloon, but the pub remains broadly a male space, particularly the public bar, and a woman drinking alone in the public bar in 1952 is making a statement she has to be prepared to defend. By the end of the decade, this is softening, but it softens slowly and unevenly, and the landlady behind the bar is still more socially legible than the woman sitting at the table in the corner on her own. The licensing hours are specific and enforced: 11 to 3 in the afternoon, 6 to 10:30 in the evening, with a bell at 10:10 to signal last orders, and a second bell at past to indicate that the landlord means it this time. The licensing laws date from the First World War, when the government restricted pub hours to improve factory productivity, and they will remain essentially unchanged for decades, outlasting the factories they were designed to protect. When the bell goes at 10:30, there is a brief civilized scramble to finish drinks, and then the pub empties into the cold street and the night. This is the real function of the pub: the evening decompression, the social reset. The place where the day gets put down and left before you go home to the house, and the wife and the children and the problems that are waiting there. You do not solve anything in the pub. You simply pause from it. And tomorrow the pause will be available again at 6 o'clock, with the fire on and the landlord ready, and the bitter exactly as it was last night, and the night before, as far back as you can remember. If you're a woman in 1950s London with a family, you're working harder than almost anyone in the city, and almost none of it is being counted. The post-war years bring a very specific set of expectations for women, particularly married women. You keep the house, you manage the money, you stretch the rations, you raise the children, you make everything function, and you do all of this without complaint and ideally without anybody noticing the effort involved. The magazines will tell you that a clean home is a happy home. The neighbours will form quiet opinions about your net curtains, and your husband will come home from his 8-hour shift and sit down in the armchair as though he has personally been carrying the city on his back all day. The day of a housewife in 1950s, London follows a rhythm that is both highly organised and entirely without structure, because the structure is whatever the day demands, and the day demands everything. Monday is washing, a morning of hot water boiled in the copper, sheets and shirts run through the mangle in the backyard, the whole house humid with the steam of laundry drying on a rack or a line if the weather cooperates, which in London is not its most common mode. Tuesday is ironing, Wednesday the shopping and the heavy cleaning. The week has a domestic logic to it, and if you fall behind it, you feel it. Not because anyone tells you off, but because the house tells you off in the language of piled laundry and unswept stairs. Children are managed continuously, rather than in dedicated blocks. The baby, and in 1950s London it is not unusual to have 3, 4, 5 children, requires feeding, changing, settling, resettling, and the particular focused attention of a parent who has no other option because there is no nursery, no childcare that working families can afford, and no infrastructure of parental leave. You are the infrastructure. You are the entire provision. The pram is in the backyard in fine weather, the baby sleeping in it while you hang the washing 2 feet away, one ear permanently tuned to the frequency of waking. The housekeeping money is given by the husband at the end of the week, a fixed sum, sometimes a generous one, sometimes not, and it covers food, cleaning materials, children's clothes, any household necessities, all of it. The management of this money is a skill that women develop the way tradesmen develop skills, through practice, through error, through watching how your mother did it and adjusting for inflation. You know what everything costs. You know to the penny whether the budget for the week will cover what the week needs, and if it will not, you know which category gives way first and how to make it seem like nothing has changed. And then there is the other thing, which is that a significant number of women in 1950s London are also working. They are doing piecework from home, sewing garments, assembling small components, or working part-time in shops or factories around school hours. This work is supplementary, in the accounting of the household and in the accounting of the society. It is not the main thing. The main thing is the house and the children and the husband, and if you're also working 30 hours a week on top of that, the 30 hours are the footnote and the house is the headline. The women's magazines of the decade, Woman, Woman's Own, Woman's Weekly, offer a version of domesticity that is both aspirational and slightly surreal. Gleaming kitchens, children in clean clothes, recipes that assume you have leisure and equipment that most women do not have. They are read widely anyway, because they represent something, a version of the life that is supposed to be coming, that the war was fought for, that the new welfare state is building toward. A life where things are a little easier. It has not quite arrived yet, but the magazines are confident it is on its way. The 1950s London kitchen is a room that has been asked to do an enormous amount of work with very little support. In most terraced houses, it is a narrow back room, possibly an extension, with a small gas stove, a stone or butler sink with cold running water and a separate hot tap that takes its time, a wooden draining board and a larder, a cold cupboard, sometimes with a ventilated panel to the outside wall, that serves as the refrigerator. Because there is no refrigerator. Refrigerators exist technically, but they are expensive, and most London households will not have one until the late part of the decade. You buy what you need for today. Today. Anything left over goes in the larder and you deal with it tomorrow. The gas stove has 4 rings and an oven that requires a degree of intuition to operate, because the temperature markings are either absent or optimistic. You learn your oven the way you learn a difficult personality through trial, error, and a gradual understanding of its particular moods. The top left ring runs slightly hotter than the others. The oven takes 20 minutes to reach anything useful. If you open the door too early, the sponge will sink and you will know about it for the rest of the day. These are not things written in any manual. They are things transmitted from mother to daughter at the stove, in the same kitchen, over years. The cooking itself is not elaborate. This is not a criticism. It is a reflection of what the kitchen is working with, which is limited ingredients, limited fuel, limited time, and the expectation that the meal will be ready at a specific hour because the household runs on a timetable, and the timetable does not negotiate. Monday, the cold meat from Sunday's joint, sliced and served with boiled potatoes and whatever vegetable came in from the greengrocer. Tuesday, perhaps a stew made from the bone of the joint in a pot that has been simmering since mid-morning, the kitchen filling with a smell that is genuinely wonderful and costs almost nothing. Wednesday, a pie if there is pastry, or chops if the budget is holding. The week has a culinary structure to it, and deviating from the structure requires planning that the structure itself was designed to avoid. Bread is bought rather than made in most households, though there are women who bake their own, particularly in the earlier part of the decade when the baker's bread is still subject to a government regulation on its composition that results in what most people describe as the national loaf, denser, darker, more wholesome than anyone asked for. When white bread comes back freely, it is greeted with something approaching relief that seems disproportionate, until you remember that people had been eating the brown alternative under compulsion, and had opinions about it they had been keeping politely to themselves. The washing up is done by hand, in the sink, with washing up liquid or a block of household soap. There is no dishwasher. There will not be a dishwasher in most London homes for another 20 years. And the first time you describe the concept to someone currently standing at a 1950s sink, working through a stack of dinner plates, they will look at you the way people look at things they want very much, but do not quite believe in, like a unicorn or central heating. What the kitchen produces day after day is not celebrated. It simply appears on the table at the right time, feeding the household, and its absence would be noticed and commented upon in a way that its presence never is. That is the arithmetic of domestic labour in 1950s London, and the kitchen is where you feel it most clearly. Children in 1950s, London are operating with a level of freedom that would cause modern parents to stop breathing entirely. From about the age of 7, you are more or less allowed to roam. You go to school, the local one, you walk, and after school you're outside until dark, which in winter means 5 o'clock and in summer means 9. And the primary supervision you receive is a vague awareness that someone's mother is watching from behind the net curtains on the next street. The street is your playground, your social network, your entire world. You play with a ball or a hoop or nothing at all. The games are improvised from whatever the street provides. A lamppost is a wicket. A chalk line on the pavement is the boundary. A bomb site, and there are still bomb sites in London in the early 1950s, empty lots of cleared rubble where houses used to be, is an adventure playground of the most genuinely adventurous kind, full of bricks and gaps and hollow spaces that an adult would find alarming and a 10-year-old finds irresistible. The bomb site is technically off-limits. This information has been received and filed under irrelevant. Pocket money, if it comes, is minimal 3p or 6p a week, and it is spent with considerable deliberation at the sweet shop, which sells individual sweets by weight from large glass jars. Sherbet lemons, aniseed balls, licorice bootlaces, pear drops that smell synthetic and taste wonderful. Sweets were rationed until 1949, and then de-rationed, and then re-rationed when demand exceeded supply, finally coming off the ration for good in 1953, and children who are old enough to remember the before times treat the sweet shop with a reverence that younger ones do not understand. Toys are not plentiful. Christmas brings something significant. A bike, perhaps, if the family has managed to save across the year, or a doll with a proper face, or a train set that will be set up on the living room floor and then carefully packed away again, because the living room floor is not permanently available for train sets. For birthdays and the rest of the year, the expectations are lower. You make do. You play with what there is. You invent games. The capacity to be amused by very little is developed young and maintained throughout life, and it produces a generation of adults who are baffled by the idea of being bored. Television, by the mid-1950s, is beginning to reach children in the form of specific programming. Watch with Mother in the afternoons, with its puppets and its gentle presenters, and later children's hour programming that gathers the household's younger members in front of the set, with an attention that parents find mildly alarming. The television is a new presence in the home, and its relationship with children is still being negotiated. The concern is not screen time in the modern sense. The concern is more that the children have stopped going outside, which is where children are supposed to be, in the fresh air, doing something physical, getting dirty, coming home at dark and eating their tea without complaint. You grow up fast in 1950s London, not because childhood is harsh, but because the boundary between childhood and contribution is drawn earlier than it will be later. At 10, you run errands. At 12, you are trusted to look after younger siblings. At 14, you might have a Saturday job. At 15, you're thinking about what comes next, because what comes next is coming whether you are thinking about it or not. The school system in 1950s, Britain is sorting children like fruit at a packing house, and it is doing so with brisk efficiency at the age of 11. The 11+ examination determines whether you go to the grammar school, academic, respectable, a ticket to a white-collar life, or the secondary modern, which will prepare you for manual work and has considerably fewer pretensions about it. If you're sitting in a London classroom in 1953, there are 35 of you in the room. The teacher has a cane that is both decorative and functional, and the radiator against the far wall is the most hotly contested real estate in the building, between October and March. The classroom is ordered. This is not a metaphor. It is physically organised around authority in a way that makes the hierarchy visible and unambiguous. The teacher stands at the front before a blackboard and a desk that is raised slightly on a dais in some schools, so that the differential is architectural as well as social. The children sit in rows facing forward, in seats bolted to the floor, which limits the range of available activity to listening, writing, and the quiet internal management of whatever the lesson is doing to you. There is no group work. There is no carpet time. There is the teacher, the blackboard, and the expectation that you are paying attention. You write with a dip pen and an inkwell set into the corner of your desk, and the management of the ink is itself a minor skill. You dip too deep and you blot. You press too hard and you scratch the paper. The art of writing cleanly with a dip pen is taught with the same seriousness as the spelling and the arithmetic it is being used to record, because presentation matters, because your work is a reflection of your character, because the teacher has 35 of you to get through and has no interest in squinting at blots. The subjects are narrow and confident. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, nature study, physical education on the playground and in the hall, religious education every morning. The history is British history, taught as a sequence of kings and battles and dates to be memorised in order. The geography involves colonial maps coloured in to show the empire, which in the early 1950s is still substantial on a map and already beginning to unravel in reality. Nobody mentions the unravelling. The maps are coloured in pink. Discipline is physical and unremarkable. The cane, applied to the palm or the backside depending on the school's preferences and the severity of the offence, is used routinely for persistent disruption, cheating, or simply being the kind of child who has managed to exhaust a teacher's patience at a particularly inconvenient moment. Boys receive it more than girls. Younger children receive it less than older ones. Nobody takes their parents to school about it, because the assumption, shared by parents, teachers, and most of the children themselves, is that school discipline is the school's business, and the school probably knows what it's doing. The 11+, when it comes, is a morning of papers in a silent room, and the stakes are understood even by children too young to fully articulate them. Pass, and the grammar school opens, and the grammar school is a different world. Better books, better equipment, a different social texture, a plausible route to university. Fail, and the secondary modern awaits, and the secondary modern is not a disaster. and the people who say it is not a disaster genuinely believe it, and the children who failed the exam know something that the adults saying this do not seem to fully register, which is that it feels like one. Now we need to stop for a moment and talk about something that genuinely happened, that was genuinely terrifying, and that somehow gets left out of the cosy nostalgic version of 1950s London entirely. In December of 1952, a combination of cold, still air, coal smoke from millions of domestic fires, and industrial emissions from power stations and factories settled over London and did not leave for 5 days. The fog, if you can call it that, turned the colour of the yellow-green mustard and reduced visibility to a few feet. People walked into the Thames. Buses stopped running because drivers could not see the road. Theatre performances were abandoned because the fog was drifting into the auditoriums, and people died, thousands of them. The smog, the word is a compound of smoke and fog, coined in London in the early 20th century for exactly this kind of event, is not a new phenomenon in 1952. London has been famous for its fog since at least the early industrial era, and the pea super, as it is colloquially known, is a recurring seasonal feature that Londoners have adapted to with the particular resignation they apply to most things the weather does. You carry a torch, you keep close to the buildings, you follow the curb. This is the received wisdom, and in ordinary fog years it is adequate. The Great Smog of December 1952 is not an ordinary fog year. It begins on the 5th and does not clear until the 9th. And during those 4 days the city is operating in conditions that are medieval in character if not in date. Visibility in some areas is measured in inches. Cattle at Smithfield Market for the Earl's Court show suffocate and have to be killed. The fog enters buildings through every gap. You can taste it inside your own house. A sulphurous catch at the back of the throat. An eye-watering chemical presence that no amount of closing windows entirely eliminates. Street crime rises because you cannot see your hand in front of your face, and neither can the person robbing you. The death toll is not acknowledged immediately or fully. The government's initial figures are conservative, attributing around 4,000 extra deaths to the smog, mainly from respiratory and cardiac causes among the elderly and those already unwell. Later analysis puts the figure considerably higher, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 excess deaths in the weeks following the event, as the damage done to lungs in those 5 days worked its way through the population. At the time, these numbers are managed quietly. There is no public inquiry. There is no immediate legislation. There is, for a time, essentially nothing. What there is, eventually, is the Clean Air Act of 1956, which introduces smokeless zones, restricts the burning of coal in open fireplaces in urban areas, and begins the slow process of changing how London heats itself. It is one of the most significant pieces of environmental legislation in British history, and it is the direct consequence of 5 days in December 1952, when the city choked on what it had been producing for 150 years. The smog is the reason the London sky begins to clear in the second half of the decade. It is the reason the last of the great pea supers fades from living memory rather than from history. And it is, in a grim and specific way, the reason that the air you breathe in London today is as clean as it is. The people who lived through it remember it as both ordinary and extraordinary, something they managed, something they endured, something that was simply happening and therefore had to be got through. That is, in the end, the 1950s London response to most things. It is happening. You're getting through it. The kettle is on. Something is changing in the living rooms of London in the 1950s, and it is changing fast. The television set has arrived. It is a large brown cabinet in the corner of the room. It has a screen roughly the size of a dinner plate, and it receives exactly one channel, the BBC, which broadcasts for a few hours in the evening and goes off at around 10:30 with the national anthem. And yet the entire street has an opinion about it. If your family got one early, perhaps for the coronation in 1953, when television shops report selling sets as fast as they can stock them, there is an unspoken social rearrangement happening on your road. The television changes the living room, the way a new piece of furniture always changes a room, except that this piece of furniture also changes what you do in the room, which is something furniture rarely achieves. Before the television, the living room in a 1950s terrace is organised around conversation and the radio, the wireless, as it is still called, a wooden box on the sideboard that provides news, drama, comedy and music. You sit in your chairs, you talk, or you listen, or you read, and the room faces itself. After the television, the room faces the corner. Everything rotates. Every chair repositions. The room has a new orientation, and the television is its new north. The picture is black and white, and the resolution, by any subsequent standard, is not impressive. The image has a tendency to roll, a slow, vertical drift that requires manual adjustment via a dial on the set, and which seems to choose its moments, arriving reliably during the most important scenes of whatever drama you're watching. The aerial on the roof needs positioning with an exactness that the weather does not maintain, and after a heavy wind there is a knock at the door from a neighbour asking if you could possibly ask your son to go up and adjust it, because the picture has gone diagonal. The programmes are not extensive. The BBC broadcasts from 3 in the afternoon, a children's programme, then a gap called the Toddler's Truce during which transmissions stop so that parents can put young children to bed, then resuming in the evening with the news, a drama or variety show, and then close down. Independent television, ITV, launches in 1955 and brings with it something the BBC has not yet managed: entertainment that is designed to be enjoyed rather than improving. The first night of ITV features a circus act and a reception from the BBC that suggests they're watching a neighbour throw a very loud party they were not invited to. Neighbours without a set come over to watch. This is understood and accommodated, particularly for significant events: the coronation, the cup final, the occasional heavyweight boxing match that arrives from America on the newsreel, and then increasingly live. You arrange your chairs, you put out the biscuits, you watch in a group, which is actually not so different from going to the cinema, except warmer and with a better biscuit situation. The television set is also a status object in the early part of the decade, and the aerial on the roof tells the street what is inside. Some families put aerials up before they can afford the set, which tells you everything about how much status matters and how little it costs to gesture at it. By the end of the decade, television is not a novelty and not a luxury. It is simply there, in the corner, on most evenings, part of the household's rhythm as completely as the kettle and the coal fire. The novelty has gone. The furniture has settled into its new arrangement. The room faces the corner, and it will face the corner forever. On the 2nd of June, 1953, London does something it has not done in a very long time. It allows itself to feel genuinely, unreservedly celebratory. The new Queen, Elizabeth II, is being crowned at Westminster Abbey, and the entire country is finding places to watch, cheer, and eat sandwiches in the rain. The crowds on the Mall begin gathering the night before, sleeping on pavements under newspaper and oilskins, with the particular British determination of people who have decided that discomfort is simply the price of historical witness. 3 million people are estimated to line the route. It is cold, it is drizzling, and everybody agrees it is magnificent. The coronation is also the first major public event to be televised in Britain, and the decision to allow cameras inside Westminster Abbey is not taken without argument. The BBC and a contingent of the establishment have concerns, dignity, solemnity, the idea that the sacred rite of anointing should not become a spectacle. The Queen herself, reportedly, pushes for the cameras to be admitted, and they are, and the result is that 27 million people in Britain watch the ceremony on television, while another 11 million listen on the radio. For context, the total population of Britain is around 50 million. This is not a television audience. It is a national gathering conducted through a screen. In houses across London that have sets, the living rooms fill with neighbours from the street who have come to watch. Extra chairs are brought in from the kitchen. Children sit on the floor. The curtains are drawn against the June light to improve the picture quality. which in 1953 means a black and white image on a small screen in a darkened room, through which you can just about make out the Abbey and the figures moving within it, accompanied by the measured commentary of Richard Dimbleby, whose voice on this day achieves a quality of reverence that the moment seems genuinely to call for. Outside, the street parties are happening in the rain and continuing anyway. Trestle tables brought out from church halls and school canteens are set up the length of residential streets, covered with tablecloths and loaded with food that has been prepared over the preceding days. Sandwiches, sausage rolls, trifle, jelly, tinned salmon with cucumber, by the women of the street working in a kind of distributed catering operation across a dozen kitchens. The children are given paper Union Jacks on sticks. There are races. There is cake. There is a photograph taken that will sit in an album in someone's sideboard drawer for the next 60 years. The mood is not simple. The war ended 8 years ago and the privations have not fully lifted. Rationing is still in place. The housing is damaged and overcrowded and the city is still rebuilding. But the coronation carries with it a genuine feeling, acknowledged at the time and reaching back to read it honestly now, of something beginning. Elizabeth is 26 years old. She's young, which feels important. The phrase New Elizabethan Age appears in the newspapers with an optimism that the newspapers have not deployed in some time. There is an idea in the air, a fragile but real idea, that the country is turning a corner. Whether the corner is turned is a question history answers slowly, and the 1950s will have their own griefs and contradictions to work through. But on that wet June morning, on the mall and in the living rooms and at the street party tables across the city, something is felt, something is meant. A new queen is being crowned, and London, which has survived a great deal, has dressed itself up and come out to watch. Before 1948, going to the doctor in Britain was something you had to afford. By the time the 1950s settle in, the National Health Service is 5 years old, and it is changing how working Londoners relate to their own bodies in ways that are still being absorbed. For the first time, you can go to the GP without calculating whether the bill will mean going without coal this week. You can take your child to the dentist without it being a financial event. The waiting room is small, the appointment is brief, the doctor is probably called something like Frobisher and addresses you by your surname, and the consultation lasts approximately 4 minutes, but it is free, and that remains quietly astonishing. The GP's surgery is in a converted ground floor room of a Victorian house, or possibly a purpose-built single-storey building that went up after the war as part of the reconstruction. The waiting room has wooden chairs arranged in a row against the wall, and magazines that are several months old, arranged on a low table with the authority of objects that have been there a long time and intend to stay. There is no appointment system, not universally. In many practices you simply attend and wait, and the wait depends on how many people came before you and how long their problems are taking. You sit, you wait. You do not complain, because complaining about waiting for free medical care feels like a particular species of ingratitude that nobody is ready to perform publicly in 1953. The doctor sees you in a room that smells of antiseptic and old wood. He, and it is almost always he, sits behind a desk and you sit opposite, and there is a physical examination couch against one wall that you may or may not be invited to lie on depending on the nature of your complaint. The consultation has a particular rhythm. The doctor asks, you answer. The doctor makes notes in a card that lives in a manila folder in a filing system he manages himself. And then the doctor tells you what he thinks and what you should do about it. His manner may be warm or may be brisk, but it will be authoritative, because the 1950s doctor is not yet operating in an era of shared decision-making. He knows. You are told. Prescriptions are written on a pad and dispensed at the chemist on the high street, which is also where you can buy a proprietary remedy without seeing a doctor at all. The chemist in 1950s London is a figure of considerable standing, someone with knowledge, someone you can ask questions of without an appointment, someone who will look at the thing on your child's arm and give you an honest assessment and some calamine lotion. The chemist knows the neighbourhood. The chemist knows the families. This is not anonymous retail. It is community pharmacology with a counter between you and the shelves. Dentistry is a more complicated story. The NHS offers dental treatment free at the point of use from its inception, and the initial demand is extraordinary. Millions of people who have been living with pain and decay and the financial impossibility of treatment arrive at dental surgeries across the country in the late 1940s and early 1950s in a wave that the service struggles to absorb. Small charges are introduced in 1951, which causes a political crisis that brings down a minister, which tells you how seriously the principle is being held. By the 1950s, the dental NHS is functioning, and working Londoners' teeth are slowly getting better. The generation before them wore dentures in their 30s. This generation may not have to. That is progress, quiet, incremental, and easy to underestimate, which is the kind of progress the 1950s mostly runs on. London in the 1950s is changing in ways that not everyone is comfortable with, and that will define the city for the rest of the century. The arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948 opened a door, and through the 1950s, people from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan and East Africa are arriving in London looking for work, drawn by labour shortages in industries the city cannot run without. The buses, the hospitals, the textile factories, the night shifts nobody else wants. They move into lodging houses in Brixton, Notting Hill, Hackney and Southall, often to a reception that ranges from cool to hostile. The legal position is unambiguous. As British subjects, citizens of the Commonwealth and colonies have the right to live and work in Britain, and they are in many cases actively recruited. London Transport sends representatives to Barbados. The NHS recruits nurses from Trinidad and Jamaica. You've been invited, you've come. What has not been arranged is where you will live once you arrive, what the landlady on the ground floor will say when she sees you, or what your workmates will make of you on the first Monday morning. The gap between the legal welcome and the human one is, in 1950s London, significant and painful. The lodging houses that take in new arrivals are concentrated in specific neighbourhoods, and the concentration creates communities, not by design, but by the logic of going where someone you know already lives, where there is a church that resembles the one at home, where there is a shop that sells what you're used to eating, where the landlord does not turn you away at the door. Brixton becomes Jamaican, Notting Hill becomes West Indian, Southall becomes Punjabi, not because these communities chose segregation, but because the city offered them, in practical terms, a limited set of doors that would open. Work is available, and work is taken. The buses need conductors, and the hospitals need nurses, and the textile factories need workers, and the construction sites need labourers, and the newcomers fill these roles with the competence and commitment of people who have moved a very long way for the opportunity. What they encounter at work varies enormously. Some workplaces absorb new colleagues without incident. Others maintain a studied hostility, a refusal to eat at the same table or use the same facilities, backed by an informal code that nobody writes down because it does not need to be written down to operate. The 1950s ends with the Notting Hill riots of 1958, days of racial violence in which white mobs attack black residents' homes, provoked by a combination of far-right agitation and the tensions of overcrowded, under-resourced housing in a neighbourhood under pressure. The riots are not the story of the decade, but they are the decade's truth about itself. The truth that sits beneath the cheerful television sets, and the Coronation Street parties, and the gradual lifting of rationing. London is becoming something new, something more complex and more various than it has been, and the process of becoming it is not comfortable or easy, or without real and serious violence. What it is also, and this is equally true, is the beginning of the city that exists now. The communities that form in the 1950s are the roots of a London that is distinct among the world's cities, with a culture and a character that could not have been produced any other way. The Windrush generation and those who followed them did not simply arrive in London. Over the decades that followed, they built a significant part of it. There is a specific and slightly heroic culinary tradition in 1950s London that deserves its own chapter, and it goes like this. You take very little, and you make it feed a family of 4 without anyone openly complaining. The great post-war British cookbook, written not on paper but in the heads of millions of housewives, is a document of astonishing resourcefulness. Dripping on toast is breakfast. The leftover bones from Sunday's joint become Monday's stock. The stale bread becomes Wednesday's bread pudding. Nothing is wasted because wasting food is not a philosophy in 1950s London. It is a moral failing, and your mother will not let you forget it. The dripping tin lives beside the stove. This is a shallow metal container into which the fat rendered from any roasting or frying is poured and left to set. A pale yellow substance with a layer of darker jelly at the bottom that is the concentrated beef or pork essence of whatever went through the pan last Sunday. You spread it on toast, you use it to fry onions, you use it for pastry. The flavour is rich and savoury and deeply unfashionable by any subsequent nutritional standard, and in 1950s London it is simply a component of cooking, the way olive oil will be for a later generation, except that it is free, produced by the cooking you are already doing, and requires nothing more than a tin and the willingness to catch the fat before it hits the floor. Soup is a serious undertaking in the 1950s London kitchen, not a tin to be opened, though tins do exist and Heinz tomato is already a fixture of working-class pantries, but a pot to be built from scratch with whatever the week has left behind. A ham bone from the weekend becomes pea and ham soup. A chicken carcass, if the household runs to chicken, which is still a relatively expensive item, becomes a broth that will stretch across 2 meals. Barley goes in to bulk it out. An onion, a carrot, some parsley from the yard if you have it. The result is genuinely good, in the way that things made slowly from honest ingredients tend to be genuinely good, and it costs almost nothing, which is the other requirement. The bread pudding is a weekly event in many households, a way of dealing with the end of the bread supply before the next loaf arrives. You soak the stale bread in milk, add an egg if you have one, dried fruit if the budget runs to it, sugar, spice, and you bake it until it is set and golden on top, dense and soft in the middle. It is absolutely not a sophisticated dish, and it is absolutely delicious, and anyone who has eaten it at a grandmother's table will spend the rest of their life looking for a version that tastes as good and never quite finding one. Because what they are tasting is not just bread pudding, but the particular alchemy of something made from nothing by someone who knew how. The Sunday roast is the week's main event, the meal toward which the food budget is oriented and around which the week's other meals are arranged. The joint goes in the oven in the morning, comes out for 1 o'clock dinner, and its remains are managed across the subsequent days with a discipline that is almost military. Cold on Monday, minced into a shepherd's pie on Tuesday, in a broth by Wednesday. By Thursday, the joint has dissolved entirely into the fabric of the week's eating, and a new one has been noted in the shopping list for the coming Saturday. The whole system is elegant in the way that things designed under constraint tend to be elegant. It wastes nothing. It feeds everyone. It repeats, week after week, in kitchens across the city, simultaneously, with minor personal variations, and the minor personal variations are the recipes. Sunday in 1950s London operates according to a different set of rules than every other day, and the main rule is this: nothing opens, nobody hurries, and the whole city settles into a particular kind of sanctioned stillness that people either find restful or slowly maddening. The shops are shut. The pubs are open for a narrow window at lunchtime and again in the evening, and no sooner. There is no Sunday trading to speak of, no supermarkets, no retail of any kind. What there is the Sunday roast, a meal that in 1950s London is less a recipe and more an institution, a weekly anchor point around which the family organises itself. Sunday morning has a distinct sound to it. The street is quieter. No delivery lorries, no factory whistles, no particular urgency in the footsteps of people on the pavement. Church bells in the distance or nearby, depending on the neighbourhood. Children sleeping slightly later than weekdays, which means until perhaps 7:30, because sleeping until 9 is not yet a concept that working-class London has entertained seriously. The Sunday newspaper arrives, the news of the world. If your household leans toward the dramatic, the Observer, if it leans toward the considered, the Sunday People for a middle path between the two. The newspaper is large and is distributed across the household. Your father has the front section, your mother has the supplement, you have the sports pages by process of elimination, and you are quite content with this arrangement. The Sunday roast begins in most households in the morning. The joint, lamb if it is spring, pork if it is autumn, beef on a good week goes into the oven at 10 or 11, and from that point the kitchen is committed. The potatoes are peeled and left in cold water. The vegetables are prepared. There is a specific Sunday smell that builds through the morning, a compound of roasting meat and rendered fat, and perhaps the hint of the pudding that will follow, a stimmed sponge or an apple crumble, or in some households a trifle assembled the day before from sponge cake, tinned fruit, jelly, custard and cream, topped with a handful of hundreds and thousands, because the hundreds and thousands are the finish line and Sunday demands a finish line. Dinner is at 1 o'clock, not approximately 1. 1. This is not a negotiable position. The meat rests, the gravy is made in the roasting tin with the juices, the vegetables are drained and buttered, and everything lands on the table simultaneously through a choreography that the person doing the cooking has perfected across years, and which looks, from the outside, much more relaxed than it is. The family sits down, the food is eaten. There is conversation, slightly more structured than weekday chat, because this is the meal where the week is discussed, where the children are asked questions, where the adults talk at a length that weekday meals do not permit. After dinner, the afternoon is long and unstructured. A walk, possibly, the park, or along the canal, or just around the block, because a Sunday walk after the roast is understood as both digestively necessary and vaguely improving. The allotment, if the family has one, which many do. The wireless in the late afternoon, the children returning muddy from wherever they went and being washed before tea. Tea at 5, which is cold meat from the lunch joint, bread and butter, and if the afternoon has been productive, a slice of cake. By evening the Sunday has wound itself down to the pub, or the wireless, or the early chapters of a library book, and by 10 the house is quiet. Tomorrow is Monday, the week begins again, but for now the Sunday pause holds, that specific stubborn stillness that 1950s London maintains against the working week, and which the city will eventually relinquish by degrees over the following decades, and which a certain kind of person will spend the rest of their life quietly mourning. The war left London with a housing problem of staggering scale. The bombs had taken out whole streets and neighbourhoods, and returning servicemen and growing families needed somewhere to live with some urgency. The solution in the short term was the prefab, a prefabricated house, assembled from factory-made panels designed to last 10 years and often lasting 40. If you are living in a prefab in 1952, you have a 2-bedroom house with running hot water, a built-in kitchen, an indoor toilet, and a small garden, which places you, in terms of amenities, ahead of quite a lot of people in traditional Victorian terraces who still share an outside privy with 3 other households. The prefab is not beautiful. Nobody designed it to be beautiful. It is a box, more or less, low-slung, pale, identical to the one next to it and the one next to that, arranged in rows on what were recently bomb sites or cleared slums, surrounded by a rectangle of garden that the occupant is expected to maintain, and often does, with a pride that surprises people who expected the residence to feel temporary. The thing about the prefab is that it does not feel temporary once you are inside it. It is warm. Warmer than the Victorian terrace because it was built with insulation that the Victorian terrace was not, and it has a fitted kitchen with cupboards, and a proper stove and a larder and a refrigerator in some versions, and that fitted kitchen alone represents an upgrade that many families are experiencing for the first time. You do not take the fitted kitchen for granted when the alternative is a scullery with a cold tap and a single shelf. The gardens become intensely personal. In a city where most working families have no private outdoor space whatsoever, The prefab garden is treated like a gift that has been slightly unexpected and is therefore appreciated the more for it. Vegetables go in, roses go in, fruit bushes, a lawn, a path from the gate to the front door, a shed at the back where tools are kept, and where a man can stand quietly for a few minutes on a Sunday afternoon without being asked anything by anyone. The shed is important. The shed is underrated. The shed is doing the work of a whole wellness industry and nobody has noticed yet. The longer-term housing solution is the council estate, large blocks and terraces of rented housing built by the London County Council and the borough councils, rising across the city throughout the decade. Some of these are low-rise terraces replacing slum streets with something newer and better maintained. Others are towers, high-rise blocks that represent, in the early and mid-1950s, a genuine architectural aspiration. The tower block in 1954 is not yet a cautionary tale. It is a vision, light, air, views, the slum street replaced by something vertical and modern and deliberately, optimistically different. The lifts work. The corridors are clean. The flats are small but have central heating, which is still, in 1954, a thing that feels almost implausibly luxurious. The council tenancy is a serious thing. You sign a tenancy agreement, you pay your rent, you're expected to maintain the property and behave as a neighbour should. Getting a council house or flat in 1950s, London requires patience because the waiting lists are long and the need is enormous. And when the letter finally arrives telling you that a property is available, the feeling, described by people who receive those letters as something close to disbelief, is the particular relief of someone who has been cold and crowded for a long time and has finally been told that this is going to change. It is not perfect. It is never perfect. But it is shelter, and it is yours. And in 1950s London, that is not nothing. That is very much something. Something is stirring in the dance halls and coffee bars of 1950s London, and the people most stirred by it are young teenagers and those in their early 20s who have grown up under rationing, who have watched their parents' generation make do and mend, and who are now, tentatively, in possession of a little disposable income and an enormous appetite for something new. The Hammersmith Palais, the Lyceum, the Mecca ballrooms, these are not polite entertainment venues. They are loud, warm, crowded, spinning with music that is moving faster than anyone's parents quite approve of. The dance hall is one of the central social institutions of working-class young London in the early part of the decade, and it operates according to its own specific codes. You pay at the door, a shilling or two, and you enter a large sprung-floor hall with a live band at one end, a bar along one wall selling soft drinks and possibly alcohol depending on the licence, and a system of social navigation that anyone from outside it would find impenetrable. Boys stand on one side, girls stand on the other. The slow migration across the floor, the asking, the accepting or declining, the brief moment of negotiation that precedes every dance, this is not random. It is choreographed social ritual performed under bright lights with 100 witnesses, and everyone knows every step. The music in the early 1950s is still largely big band and ballroom, quick-step, foxtrot, waltz, with the influence of American swing that came over with the GIs during the war still audible in the rhythm. You learn to dance because dancing is how you meet people, and meeting people is why you go, and going is the thing you do on a Friday and Saturday when you are 19 and working at a factory all week, and the dance hall is where the week becomes worth it. Then, in the mid-1950s, something shifts. American music, rock and roll, arriving through films like Blackboard Jungle, and then through Bill Haley, and then, arriving like a change in the weather, Elvis Presley begins to reach young London through cinemas and jukeboxes and the wireless. And it sounds like nothing that has been in the dance halls before. It is faster. It is louder. It has a physicality to it that the quick step does not. And the quick step's careful measured steps suddenly seem like something your father does, which is, at 19, precisely the problem with them. The coffee bar is the other venue. The twopenny tube of coffee from a machine and a formica table and a jukebox, the Gaggia espresso machine arrived in London in 1952, and the coffee bars that built themselves around it in Soho and then across the city become the daytime counterpart to the evening dance hall, a place where young people can sit for an hour on the price of one coffee and listen to music and talk and be young in a city that is, for the first time, beginning to notice that being young is a specific condition with its own requirements and its own economy. The parents of these young Londoners look at the dance halls and the coffee bars with a mixture of relief and suspicion that is entirely understandable given what the previous decade asked of them. There is something in the looseness of it, the loudness, the sheer amount of time being spent on enjoyment rather than productivity, that is slightly alarming, but it is also what they worked for. It is, in the end, what the post-war reconstruction was supposed to produce. Young people with enough ease and enough money to make noise in a dance hall on a Friday night. They just did not expect the noise to be quite that loud. While some young Londoners are perfecting their quick step at the Palais, another group is making a different kind of statement entirely, and they are doing it with a draped jacket, a bootlace tie, and enough Brill cream to grease an engine. The Teddy Boys, named for their Edwardian-inspired tailoring, are the first recognisable British youth subculture, and London in the early 1950s is where they come into their full, bewildering glory. They're working class largely. They have money for the first time, a little, earned in factories and on building sites, and they are spending it on clothes in a way that their parents find baffling, and their grandparents find frankly alarming. The drape jacket is the centrepiece. It is cut long down to the thigh, with a velvet collar and velvet pocket trim, in a silhouette that borrows from the Edwardian era and adds something of its own, a studied exaggeration, a deliberate theatrical quality, as though the wearer is performing the idea of elegance rather than simply wearing it. The trousers are narrow and sit high, exposing a considerable amount of sock, which is itself chosen for colour and thickness, with more attention than anyone who has never stood in a mirror in a narrow-trousered youth subculture can quite appreciate. The shoes are crepe-soled, thick, pale, bouncing, and are called brothel creepers, which tells you something about how the establishment views the whole enterprise. The hair is the other element, and it requires infrastructure. The Teddy Boy's hair is swept back on the sides and built up at the front into a quiff of architectural ambition, maintained throughout the day with a commitment that involves a comb carried in the back pocket and deployed at regular intervals with the seriousness of a craftsman checking his work. The back is shaped into what is known as a duck's tail, or DA, short for duck's arse, which is not a term the wearer uses in front of his mother. The whole structure requires Brill cream and determination in roughly equal measure, and it is one of the great ironies of the 1950s that the generation accused of slovenliness and moral looseness spent more time on their hair than anyone in the decade. The moral panic arrives on schedule. The newspapers take an interest in Teddy Boys after a series of incidents, fights at cinemas showing rock and roll films, confrontations in dance halls, the occasional and genuinely alarming gang violence in South London neighbourhoods, where different groups defend their territory with the bicycle chains and flick knives that the press discovers with horrified relish. The Teddy Boys are connected in the popular imagination to rock and roll, to America, to juvenile delinquency, to the general sense that something has gone slightly wrong with the young male working class. Questions are asked in Parliament. The draped jacket becomes a symbol of everything that the respectable majority fears about leisure, youth, and the loosening of social controls. What is actually going on is both simpler and more interesting than the panic suggests. The Teddy Boys are working-class young men using style as a language in a decade that has not yet given working-class young men many other languages to use. The suit is their statement. We exist, we have money, we have aesthetic opinions, and our aesthetic opinions are not the same as our fathers, and we're not apologising for that. Every flick of the comb in the public bathroom mirror is a small act of self-definition by someone who has not been given many opportunities for self-definition. It is not always admirable, it is not always safe, but it is, in its strange, quiffed, crepe-soled way, the beginning of something, the first draft of an argument about who gets to be visible in the city that will be argued, in different clothes and to different music for the rest of the century. If you're a working-class London family in the 1950s and you're going on holiday, you're almost certainly going to the same place every year, at the same week, on the same train, carrying the same suitcase, to stay in the same boarding house run by the same landlady, who will serve you the same breakfast at 8 o'clock sharp and will inform you that the front door is locked at 10. Margate, Southend, Clacton, Ramsgate. Possibly, if you are feeling adventurous, Hastings. The British seaside resort in the 1950s is operating at full capacity and has absolutely no idea that cheap flights to the Spanish coast are coming to end it within 20 years. The journey is part of the event. The train from Victoria or Liverpool Street on the first morning of the works holiday, the week or fortnight when the factory shuts and everyone in the neighbourhood leaves simultaneously, is loud and loaded with luggage and children who have been awake since 5 and are not managing the excitement gracefully. You have a paper bag of sandwiches made this morning. You have a flask of tea. The children ask how long it will take approximately every 9 minutes from the moment the train leaves the platform, and the answer is the same each time, and this does not reduce the frequency of the asking. The boarding house is a Victorian terraced house on a street 2 or 3 roads back from the seafront, converted for the purpose of providing a week's accommodation to families from London who need feeding, housing, and a moderate amount of management. The landlady is a specific type, not unkind, but firm, with a set of rules that are explained on a laminated card in the bedroom and include no cooking in the rooms, no wet towels on the furniture, breakfast at 8 and no later, evening meals at 6 and no later, and please wipe your feet. You wipe your feet. You're here to relax, and the rules are part of the structure within which relaxation occurs, and the structure is not optional. The beach is the point of all of it. You go to the beach in the morning and you stay until the children need feeding, or the tide comes in, or someone gets stung by something and needs attention. You sit in a deck chair hired for 6pence from the man by the steps. You read your paper or your library book, and you watch the children in the water, which in the North Sea off the Essex and Kent coast in July is not warm. It is bracing. It is character building. The children do not notice because they are 10 and have not yet developed the temperature sensitivity that adults accumulate steadily as a form of complaint. They splash. They shriek. They emerge eventually blue-lipped and triumphant and are dried with a towel and given an ice cream from the van at the top of the slipway, and it is genuinely one of the best days of the year. The fairground at Margate, the illuminations at Southend, the fish and chips eaten from paper on the seafront with the wind coming off the water, tasting of salt and engine oil and vinegar. These are the textures of the thing, the specific sensory details that will be carried in the memory long after the boarding house and the landlady and the laminated rules have receded. A generation of Londoners will remember the 1950s seaside holiday not as a modest week in a cold coastal town, but as something close to paradise, which is what a holiday is when you've spent the previous 50 weeks in a factory. The sun does not need to shine, the water does not need to be warm, you are not at work. That is, in 1950s London, more than enough. To understand 1950s London fully, you need to use a sense that history generally ignores: smell. The city has a particular and unmistakable scent during this decade, and it is the smell of a place that is running primarily on coal. Every house has a coal fire or two. Every power station is burning coal. Every locomotive pulling into Victoria or Waterloo is coal-fired. The air in London during winter is not clean. It is not crisp. It is a complex layered thing, part smoke, part sulphur, part damp wool from millions of coats, and if you live in it long enough you stop noticing entirely, which is probably worse. The coal smell begins with delivery. The coal man comes once a week or fortnight, depending on how fast the household burns through it, and arrives with a lorry loaded with 100-weight sacks that he carries through the side gate and tips into the coal hole beneath the front steps. The coal hole lid clangs. Coal dust rises in a brief dark cloud. The coal hole has a smell that is mineral and ancient compressed time, basically, which is what coal is, and it infuses the brick around it and the hands of the coal man and the carpet in the hallway when he passes through. And nobody minds particularly because the smell of coal is the smell of warmth, and warmth is not something to be squeamish about. Inside the house, the fire produces its own olfactory layer. Wood smoke if you're burning kindling to start it. Coal smoke as it catches. The specific smell of a banked fire overnight. Slower, denser. The coal reducing to coke and then ash, and the morning smell of a raked grate being cleared and relaid, which involves ash dust and a cold hearth, and the particular staleness of a room that has been closed since the fire went out. The chimney sweep comes twice a year. His arrival is an event that leaves a fine coating of soot over every horizontal surface in the room, regardless of the precautions taken, and the precautions taken are never quite sufficient. The street outside has its own register. The Thames, a mile or less from most of inner London, contributes a low background note that is mud and salt, and the particular organic quality of a river that is also a working estuary, fish, fuel, freight, the long history of everything that has ever gone in and come out of it. On certain days when the tide is low and the wind is right, the Thames makes itself known several streets away. Nobody calls it pleasant, nobody calls it unpleasant. It is simply the smell of the river, which is the smell of the city, which is the smell of home. The food smells layer over everything. The cabbage boiling in the kitchen of every house simultaneously at midday. A smell of such pervasiveness that it has become the defining olfactory symbol of the era. The bakery at the end of the road releasing warmth and yeast into the morning air. The fish and chip shop on a Friday evening. The hot fat and salt and vinegar carrying half a street before you arrive. The brewery at the edge of the neighbourhood whose presence is enormous and yeasty and oddly cheerful. These are not background details. They are the city's autobiography, written in the air, read unconsciously by everyone who moves through it. By the end of the decade, the Clean Air Act is beginning to thin the coal smoke, and the Great Smog is not repeated, and London's air starts slowly to change its character. Future generations will not know the coal smell. They will not miss it because they will never have known what they are missing. But for the people of 1950s London, the smell of coal smoke in winter is inseparable from the feeling of being home, which is one of the stranger things about the past, that what was harmful could also, in memory, be warm. There is an entire unwritten social code operating in every street in 1950s London, and if you have grown up in it, you know the rules instinctively even though nobody has ever explained them to you. Your front step should be clean. Your net curtains should be white or whitish. You do not want to be the family with grey net curtains because the grey net curtains are a statement, even if you did not mean them to be. Your children should be presentable when they leave the house. You should greet your neighbours by name. You should not discuss money or illness or anything that has happened behind a closed door with anyone who does not already know. The front of the house is a public statement and is managed accordingly. The step, the stone threshold at the front door, is scrubbed on a Saturday morning with a donkey stone, a soft block of abrasive chalk that leaves the step a clean pale colour and signals to the street that the occupant is keeping up their end of the bargain. In the terraces of East and South London, the step scrubbing is performed publicly and simultaneously. A row of women working their way down the street in a sequence that is not coordinated but looks it. The step is clean. The step has always been clean. The step will be clean again next Saturday. The net curtains serve a dual function that is, on reflection, more interesting than it first appears. They let light in while preventing clear visibility from the street, which means you can see out without being seen in, which means the entire street is engaged in a mutual low-level surveillance operation, conducted through white cotton mesh. You notice who comes and goes next door. You notice the unfamiliar car parked outside number 42. You notice if the curtains at number 38 stay drawn until 11 on a weekday, which they should not, and you say nothing directly but you know, and knowing is the point. The net curtain is the original social media, with all the observation and none of the commentary, at least not to anyone's face. Class is not a subject that 1950s working London discusses openly, and it is the organising principle of almost everything. You know your place in the social order with a precision that would strike most 21st century observers as extraordinary. Not just that you're working class, but where in the working class, which is itself a structure of considerable internal complexity. A skilled tradesman regards himself differently from an unskilled labourer. A factory foreman is not the same as a factory worker. The family that owns its house regards itself differently from the family that rents, even if the houses are identical from the outside and the incomes are comparable. These distinctions are maintained without fuss, registered without comment, and understood completely by everyone involved. The aspiration toward respectability is a constant, gentle pressure. Respectability does not mean wealth. It means order, cleanliness, reliability, the keeping of your word and your step and your garden. It means your children do not run wild. It means your husband is employed. It means the rent is paid and the coal is stacked and the curtains are white. It is not glamorous. It is not exciting. But in a city that has spent the last 15 years being bombed, rationed, and asked to endure more than is reasonable, respectability is the thing that holds the street together, the quiet, mutual agreement that everyone will manage themselves well enough that the whole street can function. And on most streets, on most days, they do. There is a specific approach to illness in 1950s London that can best be described as aggressive minimisation. You're not unwell. You have a bit of a cold. Your knee has been playing up, yes, since the war, but you are managing. Your back has made that sound for 3 years, but it will probably sort itself. The GP is for genuine emergencies and the children, not for the sort of things that can be managed with aspirin, a hot water bottle, and the firm belief that lying about it will eventually make it go away. This attitude is not stupidity. It is the psychological residue of a generation that spent years being told to get on with things under conditions that were genuinely life-threatening, and a sore elbow was not going to score any sympathy points. The home medicine cabinet, often an actual cabinet in the bathroom or the kitchen, metal or mirrored, contains a specific and largely unchanging inventory. Aspirin, in a large tin from the chemist. Germaline, the pink antiseptic cream in the distinctive flat tin, applied to any cut, graze or skin complaint with a confidence that suggests it can handle anything up to and including minor surgery. Calamine lotion, white and chalky, for anything that itches. Friar's balsam for chests, a brown liquid that you inhale by leaning over a bowl of hot water with a towel over your head, breathing in the vapour until your sinuses have received the message. A bandage, neatly rolled, some sticking plasters. This is your primary care system, and it is, for the overwhelming majority of things, adequate. The chemist on the high street is the first port of call for anything that seems beyond the home cabinet's capabilities, but does not quite justify involving the GP. The chemist in 1950s London is a person of genuine community, standing, trained, qualified, approachable, and possessed of a confidence in his recommendations that the modern pharmacist, surrounded by liability disclaimers, has largely had to relinquish. You describe the symptom. The chemist considers. The chemist recommends. You take what is recommended, and it often in fact works, because the conditions presenting themselves across the chemist's counter are mostly the ordinary ones that proprietary remedies exist specifically to treat. Children's illness has its own particular texture in the 1950s. The childhood diseases, measles, whooping cough, chickenpox, scarlet fever, move through schools and streets with a regularity that parents accept as part of the seasonal landscape, the way adults accept colds in winter. You keep the child home, you nurse them through it. You hope for no complications, and the complications when they come are serious in ways that the same diseases, seen now through the lens of vaccination, are easy to forget. The child recovers, usually. The household absorbs the disruption and continues. There is a kind of robustness to the 1950s sick child that is partly genuine resilience and partly the absence of any alternative to resilience, which amounts to roughly the same thing. Going to bed when ill is not straightforward in a household that cannot easily afford a day off work or a disrupted routine. Men go to work with fevers that would today send them immediately to the sofa. Women manage households with headaches and infections that would entitle a modern person to 3 days of documented sympathy. There is a phrase, carrying on, that 1950s London deploys constantly and means specifically. The thing is difficult. You know it is difficult. We are all agreeing it is difficult, and we are continuing anyway. It is, in its way, admirable. It is also, occasionally, the reason something minor becomes something serious, but that is a conversation the decade does not have the vocabulary for yet, and so it does not have it. The scaffolding of community life in 1950s, London is built on a surprising number of small recurring events, the kind that nobody announces as important but that turn out to hold everything together. The church on the corner still draws a respectable congregation on Sunday mornings, particularly among older residents and families with young children, though the pews are slightly less full than they were before the war, when faith was perhaps doing more heavy lifting. The street party, on the other hand, triggered by the coronation, by VE Day anniversaries, by royal occasions large and small, is an entirely secular event that achieves something religion aims for. It gets everyone in the same place at the same time, eating the same food, willing to be briefly on the same side. The church in the 1950s London neighbourhood is usually Anglican, though in Irish Catholic areas of Islington or Kilburn or Bermondsey it is Catholic, and in the East End Jewish communities it is the synagogue, and increasingly, as the decade advances, it is Pentecostal congregations gathering in converted shopfronts for the West Indian communities in Brixton and Notting Hill, who find, in many cases, that the Anglican Church's reception of them is something between cool and unwelcoming. The building changes, the need it meets does not. People want ceremony and belonging, and the marking of the passages of life, birth, marriage, death, in a context that feels larger than the domestic. The church, whatever its denomination, provides this, and in 1950s London it does so without a great deal of competition. The women's organisations are the practical engine of church community life, and they are remarkable institutions. The Women's Institute, the Mothers' Union, the various committees that organise the bring and buy sale, the Christmas fair, the flower rota, the visiting of the sick and the elderly, all of this is run by women who are not paid for it, and who fit it around the rest of the work they are already doing, which, as we have already established, is considerable. These organisations are not glamorous, and they are not especially celebrated, and they are the reason the neighbourhood functions at the level it does, which is something that tends to become visible only when they stop, which they mostly do not. The street party is the other engine. The preparation for a street party in 1950s London is a collective undertaking of considerable organisational complexity, disguised as a pleasant social occasion. Tables are borrowed from church halls, chairs come from everywhere. Food is prepared in a dozen kitchens and carried out on plates covered with tea towels. Someone strings bunting between the lampposts, someone else provides the gramophone. The children are given hats, there are games. There is a brief, concentrated feeling of everyone being on the same side that is genuinely moving, and that the rest of the year's worth of net curtain watching and step scrubbing competition does nothing to diminish. The working men's club, the whist drive, the darts team, the Saturday morning market, the school gate, these are all versions of the same thing, the recurring encounter, the known face, the small transaction that over years becomes a relationship. Community in 1950s. London is not sentimental, and it is not soft. It is practical. It is built from proximity and repetition, and the shared understanding that you are all in the same position, more or less, and that position requires cooperation. It is not always warm, but it holds. And in a decade that has arrived from a war and is still putting itself back together, holding is what matters most. The 4th of July, 1954. The date does not mean independence to the British, but it does mean something remarkable. Meat comes off the ration. It is the last item. Rationing, which began in 1940 for bacon, butter and sugar, and expanded to cover almost every category of food and clothing during the war years, is finally completely over. The queue outside the butcher's shop is longer than usual that morning. There are people who stand there just to feel what it's like to buy what they want. Some of them cry. A few of the older ones cannot quite bring themselves to buy more than their old allocation, because the habit of restraint has been built in for 15 years, and it does not undo itself in a day. The end of rationing does not produce an immediate transformation. The shops do not suddenly overflow. The butcher does not become a palace of abundance overnight, because the supply chains that rationing was managing have not changed shape in a single morning, and the economy is not yet producing the surplus that will characterize the later part of the decade. What changes in the first weeks and months is permission, the sense that you are now allowed to want more and buy more, and that this wanting and buying is no longer a form of transgression against the collective good. That permission takes time to absorb. The generations that grew up during the war will carry the habits of rationing in their bones for the rest of their lives. The cleared plate, the saved fat, the piece of soap used down to a translucent sliver before it is replaced. The children born in the early 1950s and growing up through the decade are the first generation to experience something their parents could not quite take for granted. Food that is simply there. Sweets without tokens. Meat without a weekly allowance. Butter, real butter, spread at whatever thickness the person doing the spreading decides upon without calculation. These are small things. They are not small things. They are the texture of ordinary life, and the texture of ordinary life is what most of ordinary life is made of. What follows the end of rationing is, gradually and then more quickly, a consumer economy. The thing that the 1960s will be famous for is being assembled quietly in the second half of the 1950s. Hire purchase, the system of buying goods on credit with weekly repayments, is expanding rapidly, bringing washing machines and televisions and eventually refrigerators and vacuum cleaners into homes that would previously have had to save for years to afford them outright or go without. The hire purchase agreement is signed at the shop, a deposit is paid, and the machine arrives. The weekly payment is small enough to absorb into the household budget. Suddenly the household has a washing machine. The washing machine changes Monday. Monday is no longer the copper, the mangle, the red hands and the steam, and the half day of physical labour. Monday is a dial and a drum, and a couple of hours of waiting. The decade ends with London not yet prosperous in the way the 1960s will be, but prosperous in a way the 1940s could not have imagined. There is enough. There is increasingly more than enough, and the more than enough is new and disorienting and wonderful, and it arrives just in time for a generation of young people who have never known anything else to take it entirely for granted, which is perhaps the most reliable sign that ordinary life has genuinely improved. By the late 1950s, London is in a state of quiet transformation that nobody yet has the language to fully describe. The bomb sites are slowly being built over, not always with what anyone would call vision, but with speed, because there are people who need houses. The old industries are beginning to shift. A young woman working in a Soho coffee bar in 1958 can hear something on the jukebox that sounds nothing like what was on the radio last year. A boy in Brixton is watching American television and thinking about something he cannot yet name. The city is looser than it was, slightly around the edges. The certainties about class and deference and knowing your place are still firmly in place, but they are beginning to show hairline fractures that, within a decade, will become chasms. The war is 10 years gone by the end of the decade, and it is still everywhere. It is in the missing houses on streets that have not been fully rebuilt, the gaps in the terrace like missing teeth. It is in the men who came back changed and did not entirely say so, and who managed the unremarked damage by going to the pub and working hard and not talking about it. Because not talking about it is the agreement the decade made with itself. It is in the women who ran everything for 6 years and then handed it back and were expected to find fulfillment in it, which some of them did and some of them did not. and the ones who did not are reading the women's magazines and noticing something in the gap between what the magazines describe and what the kitchen feels like at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. The young, though, the young are not carrying the war the same way. They were too small for it, or were born after it, and the post-war world is simply the world to them, the only one they know, and from where they are standing, from the coffee bar and the dance hall and the new council flat and the grammar school that the 11 Plus opened, or the secondary modern that it did not, the world looks like it has more in it than it used to. More money, a little. More music, definitely. More possibility, not the soaring possibility of a generation that believes in its own transformation, not yet, but the smaller possibility of a Saturday with sixpence in your pocket and somewhere to go, which is more than your parents had at the same age, and you know it, even if you would not say so. The city itself is changing shape. The suburbs are expanding, the new estates pushing out into Hertfordshire and Essex and Surrey, the underground lines stretching to follow them, new towns being built at Stevenage and Harlow and Crawley, to receive the Londoners who are being decanted from the bombed and overcrowded inner boroughs. The inner city is being rebuilt, not always well, not always with the needs of its residents at the centre of the planning, but rebuilt with a sense that the wartime London of rubble and gap sites is finally becoming something else. The tower blocks going up on the horizon of Hackney and Peckham are the future arriving in concrete, and the concrete is optimistic in the way that 1950s civic architecture always is, right up until it is not. The decade ends and London does not make a ceremony of it. The new year arrives on the 1st of January 1960, and the city does not feel like something that has just finished. It feels like something that has been running all along, building speed, and the speed is now becoming noticeable. The rationing is over, the television is on, the coffee bar jukebox is playing something your parents have not heard before, and you have had memorised for a month. The city is 8 million people, each of them doing the same thing they did yesterday, and a few of them doing something slightly different, and the slightly different is beginning to add up. You came in here out of the cold, all those years ago, pulled the eiderdown up, put the kettle on, and the city went on around you, loud and quiet, grey and bright, building itself out of coal smoke and rationing books and net curtains and bus queues, and the particular stubbornness of a place that has decided, without ceremony, to keep going. That is what London was in the 1950s. That is what London is always, if you know where to listen for it. And so here we are. At the end of a day, a long grey, coal-scented, thoroughly British day, in 1950s London. You have woken up in a cold bedroom and negotiated the geyser. You have eaten your toast with margarine and drunk your tea the colour of a worn boot. You have stood on the upper deck of the bus in the freezing dark, newspaper folded into quarters, not making eye contact, which is its own kind of companionship. You have worked at the factory, at the office, in the kitchen, on the shop floor, in the narrow back room where the gas stove has opinions and the larder keeps the cold. You have queued, you have managed, you have carried on, and somehow, in all of that, in the rationing and the smog and the inkwells and the 11 Plus and the geyser that took 3 matches this morning, there was a life. A full, warm, specific, human life. People fell in love on the upper deck of the bus. Children spent whole summers on bomb sites and came home with scraped knees and the kind of joy that does not require anything to have been bought. Neighbours knocked on doors with coal when someone else had run out. Families sat around a television set the size of a dinner plate and watched a young queen be crowned and felt briefly and sincerely that something was beginning. These people did not think of themselves as resilient. Resilience was not a word they used about themselves. They just got on with it. Got on with the cold, the grey food, the long shifts, the slow accumulation of a life built from small, reliable things. The Sunday roast, the clean step, the cup of tea, the street they knew well enough to navigate in fog. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed with your central heating and your fridge full of food that came without tokens and your hot water that does not require a match and a prayer, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the 8 million people who did all of this, every day, in a city that was still pulling itself out of the rubble, and chose, without making a speech about it to keep going anyway. They were not perfect. The decade was not perfect, but they were stubborn and kind in the particular undemonstrative way that working London is kind, and they built something: the NHS, the clean air, the council houses, the dance halls, the communities that are still visible in the city today if you know where to look. History may be cold and smoky and occasionally terrifying, but it is also, always, people doing their best in the circumstances they were handed. And the people of 1950s London were handed quite a lot of circumstances, and they handled most of them with a composure that deserves more credit than it usually gets. Now dim the lights a little further. Let the city go quiet around you. The bus has made its last run. The pub has called last orders. The television has played its national anthem and gone dark. Somewhere on a London street a coal fire is burning down to ash, and someone has banked it carefully so it will still be there in the morning. Sleep well. You've earned it. And they definitely had.